You're listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Wednesday evening, folks. I get my days mixed up sometimes. It's Wednesday. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to my show, the Intrepid radio program, here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. And you can come and listen to and watch the video simulcast here over at my YouTube channel. And that's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts, as if I haven't said this 200 times. And so, by the way, speaking of 200 times, mark your calendars, because next Thursday, the 28th of May, marks an anniversary of this show of sorts. It is going to be the 200th episode of the Intrepid radio program here on the Odyssey Radio Network. 200 episodes down by next Thursday, the 28th. So mark it. We're going to do something special that day. Not quite sure what yet, but we'll get there when we get there, and then we'll know if it's special. Maybe it'll just be a typical show, and we'll go, hey, happy 200. But put it on your calendars. And so 200 episodes. So after 200 times of saying Odyssey Radio and youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts, you'd think I wouldn't mess it up. But I do from time to time. That's my humanity eking through, my human nature, my human error that comes into play, or my lack of caffeine, whichever it might be. And so, at any rate, welcome to the show. I hope you go over to the YouTube channel to join the live chat room going on right now as we're broadcasting this episode. And you can go over to Odyssey Radio and find out all the places where you can find this show being broadcast tonight in its audio form or video form. Now, let's move on. I'm going to hit a topic over the next few days that I hope will not make the ladies feel a bit alienated, because it's not excluding you really, but I'm going to be focusing on a men's issue, the issue of masculinity. What is true masculinity? And where I think that this is relevant to the women who are in the audience is that you can maybe get some ideas of a different point of view of what true masculinity is for the men in your life that you're either mated to, married to, that are children of yours, relatives of yours, friends of yours, whatever it might be. It'll give women an idea of what masculinity is. And of course, there are definitions that are all over the board. When you think of masculinity, you think of machismo and things like that, and who's more macho? I remember that from a Saturday Night Live routine way back in the early 80s. Who's muy macho? And so that's not what masculinity is. Nor is masculinity part of femininity. Or does femininity fit into masculinity? We're going to look at this, and we're going to dig into it, and there's going to be a lot of opinions, maybe some controversy in it, but this is something that I've modified over the years. I used to, when I was in my ministry days, and then in my lay ministry days, I worked with men's groups, and we talked about the pillars of masculinity. And I think the men, I need you to listen closely and throw in your opinions and see what you think. I don't think masculinity is being all, my tenderness side. That's part of masculinity, but there are some things I want us to talk about in greater depth and detail. And again, for the women, I think you will enjoy this, and maybe you will have a lot of input into this over in the chat room as we go along. You can add to this and see what you think. And what I'm going to look at, though, it's mainly from what I would call a Jungian point of view, a Jungian philosophical base when it comes to psychology. And what is Jungian, you might ask? Now, you know who Carl Jung was, and I've pulled up just a little bit about Jungian philosophy. And this is a lot of what drives me. I say I use a Jungian model when I do tarot readings, because Jungian used the tarot. But Jung was one of those fathers of modern psychology, who lived into, I think about the 60s is when he died in his old age, the 1960s. But there is a Jungian model of the psyche that I want you to look at and see. And so listen to this and see what you think of this. There's a few people have had as much influence on modern psychology as Carl Jung did. We have Jung to thank for concepts like extroversion and introversion archetypes, modern dream analysis, the collective unconsciousness. Their psychological terms coined by Jung include the archetype, the complex, synchronicity, and it's from his work that the Myers-Briggs type indicator, the MBTI, was developed. It's a popular staple of personality tests still used today. And among Jung's most important work was his in-depth analysis of the psyche, which he explained as follows. These are Jung's words. He said, "By psyche, I understand the totality of all psychic processes, conscious as well as unconscious." And so he separated the concept from conventional concepts of the mind, which is generally limited to the processes of the conscious brain alone. So Jung believed that the psyche is a self-regulating system, rather like the body, one that seeks to maintain a balance between opposing qualities while constantly striving for growth, a process Jung called individuation. And Jung saw the psyche as something that could be divided into these components, these component parts and complexes and archetypical contents personified in a metaphorical sense and functioning rather like secondary selves that contribute to the whole. And his concept of the psyche is broken down as follows. Now, you might enjoy this from a purely psychological standpoint. And he also, while I said that I use a Jungian approach to the tarot, you'll see this buried in his concepts of how the mind works, how the psyche works. First thing Jung talked about was the ego. Now, this is before we're getting to masculinity, unless you're trying to make the connection there. I want to give a little background as to the basis for the way I view masculinity. And let me give you a little clue. There's something I picked up from a book many years ago. It was a book I found at a garage sale for like a dime, like back in the 90s sometime. And it was called King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, The Four Pillars of Masculinity. And it was by Moore and Gillette. And these guys were also Jungian psychologists. And so this is where I pick up maybe my title, maybe the overall theme is looking into the four pillars of masculinity. And so let's go on with this. The ego is the first one of Jung's, how he breaks down the psyche. To Jung, the ego was the center of the field of consciousness, the part of the psyche where our conscious awareness resides, our sense of identity, our sense of existence. And we all possess this, whether we're masculine or female, or feminine, male or female. And this part can be seen as a kind of a command headquarters, an organizing of our thoughts, our feelings, our senses, our intuitions, and regulating access to memory. It's that part of our minds, of our psychological makeup that links the inner and the outer worlds together, forming how we relate to that which is external to us. And how a person relates to the external world is, according to Jung, determined by their levels of extroversion or introversion. and how they make use of the functions of thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition. And some people have developed more of one or two of these facets than the others, which shapes how they perceive the world around them. The origin of the ego lies in the self archetype, where it forms over the course of early development as the brain attempts to add meaning and value to its various experiences. As a baby matures and starts to grow up, becomes a toddler and then a young child, and then eventually, into the teens and early adulthood, they are developing this self-archetype. And the brain is attempting and working at adding meaning and value to the experience of the individual. And so the ego is just one small portion of the self. However, Jung believed that consciousness is selective. And the ego is part of the self that selects the most relative information from the environment and chooses a direction to take based on that environment. And while the rest of the information sinks into the unconscious mind. And it might therefore show up later in the form of dreams, visions, entering into the world that way, eking into the conscious world through those things. So the ego was his first one. The second is the personal unconscious. Jung promoted the personal unconscious. The personal unconscious arises from the interaction between the collective unconsciousness. Hang on, I'm sorry, I forgot to turn off my phone. And that's my dad calling, so I'll have to call him back. Sorry to do that on a live radio show. Let me turn off my ringer right now. And there you go, scintillating semi-live radio. So let me turn off my ringer. Sorry about that, folks. So the personal unconscious. What's going on behind our brain, or beneath the foundations of the things that have sunk back into the unconscious. The unconscious arises from the interaction between the collective unconsciousness and one's personal growth. That's the personal unconsciousness. And it was defined by Jung as follows. This is a quote from Jung. Everything of which I know, but of which I am not at the moment thinking. Everything of which I was once conscious, but have now forgotten. Everything perceived by my senses, but not noted by my conscious mind. Everything which involuntarily and without paying attention to it, I feel, think, remember, want, and do. All the future things which are taking shape in me and will sometime come to consciousness, all this is the content of the unconscious. Besides these, we must include all more or less intentional repressions of painful thought and feelings. I call the sum of these contents the personal unconscious. And that's what Jung had to say. So the things that have molded us, that we forget the learning process of those things. We may remember events and personalities and things like that, but the way our psyche has formed around those, and it has formed who we are, that is deep in the unconscious. This is the personal unconscious. So unlike Freud, Jung, who was a close contemporary of Jung's, and as a matter of fact, they parted ways over major differences in psychology, personal things. Unlike Freud, Jung saw repression as just one element of the unconscious, rather than the whole of it. Jung saw the unconsciousness, or unconscious, as the house of potential future development. And so the place where as yet undeveloped elements coalesced into conscious form. Then he goes on and talks about complexes. Complexes in the Jungian sense are themed organizations in the unconscious mind, centering around patterns of memories, patterns of emotions, perceptions, wishes, hopes, dreams, patterns that are formed by experience and by an individual's reactions to those experiences. Unlike Freud, Jung believed complexes could be very diverse, rather than individuals simply having a core sexual complex. Like Freud said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, Oh, and by the way, go get yourself some Stucci cigars. Just throw that in there for free. So complexes often behave in a rather automatic manner, which can lead a person to feeling like the behavior that arises from them is out of his or her control. Have you ever been there? Where you think, this is out of my control, this is just what's coming from inside of me. And people who are mentally ill or mislabeled as possessed often have complexes that take over regularly and markedly. Now, it's not saying possession doesn't occur. It's just saying that many times it's the involuntary complexes that take over regularly. And so complexes are strongly influenced by the collective unconscious. And as such, they tend to have archetypical elements. And so in a healthy individual, complexes are seldom a problem, and indeed are likely the key to balancing the rather one-sided views of the ego so that development can occur. And if the person is mentally unwell and unable to regulate his or herself, as seen in those experiencing dissociation between these different mental states, complexes may become overt and more of an issue. And in these cases, the ego is damaged, and it's therefore not strong enough to make use of the complexes via sound reflection, granting them a full and unruly life of their own. So to treat such people, Jung looked more toward future development than simply dealing with their pasts. He tried to find what the symptoms meant and hoped to achieve and work with them from that angle. He went on to speak about the collective unconscious, the collective rather than the personal unconscious. The theory of the collective unconscious is one of Jung's more unique theories. Jung believed, unlike many of his contemporaries, Freud included, that all the elements of an individual's nature are present from birth. Everything you are is already there. It's already in you. Remember when we were talking about Solomon the last few days, and we talked about how David wrote, in my mother's womb you knew me, you formed me, I came out being who I was supposed to be. Paraphrasing David. And so all these elements of the individual, according to Jung, are present at birth, and that the environment of the person brings them out rather than the environment creating them. We are products of our environment only in the sense that our environment brings out the natural things that we are born with. It doesn't create those things in us. It brings them out. Jung felt that people are born with a blueprint already in them that will determine the course of their lives, something which, while controversial at the time, is fairly widely supported up to today, owing to the amount of evidence there is in the animal kingdom for various species being born with a repertoire of behaviors uniquely adapted to their environments. And so it's been observed that these behaviors in animals are activated by environmental stimuli in the same manner that Jung felt human behaviors are brought to the fore. According to Jung, the term archetype, or archetype, however you want to say it, is not meant to denote an inherited idea, but rather an inherited mode of functioning, corresponding to the inborn way in which the chick emerges from the egg, the bird builds its nest, a certain kind of wasp stings the motor ganglion of the caterpillar, and eels find their way to the Bermudas. In other words, it's a pattern of behavior. This aspect of the archetype, the purely biological one, is the proper concern of scientific psychology. So Jung believed that these blueprints are influenced strongly by various archetypes in our lives, such as our parents, our other relatives, major events, births, deaths, etc., and the archetypes originating in nature and in our cultures, common symbols and elements like the moon, the sun, water, fire, etc. All these things come together to find expression in the psyche and are frequently reflected in our stories and our myths. And Jung didn't rule out the spiritual at all. Despite the biological basis he described the personality as having, he also felt there was an opposing spiritual polarity which greatly impacts the psyche. And then he goes on, he talks about the self. The self, according to Jung, was the sum total of the psyche, with all its potential included. This is the part of the psyche that looks forward, that looks ahead, not to the past. It contains the drive toward fulfillment and wholeness. In this, the self was said to drive the process of individuation, the quest of the individual to reach his or her fullest potential. And in this area, Jung once again is seen as differing vastly from Freud. In Freudian theory, the ego is responsible for the above processes and forms the axis on which a person's individual psychology spins, whereas in Jungian theory, the ego is just one part which rises out of infinitely more complex self. And Jung goes on to the persona. Jung said that the persona is an element of the personality which arises for reasons of adaptation or personal convenience. If you have certain masks that you put on in various situations, we've all done it, such as the side of yourself you present at work or to family or in social gatherings, that is a persona. The persona can be seen as the public relations part of the ego, and the part that allows us to interact socially in a variety of situations with relative ease. And those who identify too strongly with their personas, however, can run into problems. If your persona is, let's say, if I say my persona is one of a radio personality of sorts, if I stick too strongly with that persona, I'm going to make some big mistakes in my life. And so you have to think of the celebrity who becomes too involved with his self or herself, the star. I'm a star. And the person who can't leave work at work, or the academic who seems condescending to everyone else. Doing the aforementioned can stunt someone's personal growth a great deal, as other aspects of the self that can't properly develop, crippling overall growth. The persona usually grows from the parts of people that wished once to please teachers, parents, and authority figures, and as such, it leans heavily toward embodying only one's best qualities, leaving those negative traits which contradict the persona to form in the shadow, which is the next one. Those traits that we dislike or would rather ignore, they come together to form what Jung called the shadow. This part of the psyche, which is also influenced heavily by the collective unconsciousness. It's a form of complex, and it's generally the complex that's most accessible by the conscious mind. Jung didn't believe that the shadow was without purpose or merit. He just felt that where there's light, there must also be shadow, which is to say that the shadow has an important role to play in balancing the overall psyche. Without a well-developed shadow side, a person can easily become shallow and extremely preoccupied with the opinions of others, a walking persona. Just as conflict is necessary to advance the plot of any good novel, how resistance is necessary in building muscle, light and dark are necessary to our personal growth. And Jung believed that, not wanting to look at their shadows directly, many people project them onto others, meaning that the qualities we can't stand in other people, we have in ourselves. And we wish not to see those things. So we sometimes refer to that as projection. We'll project the worst aspects of ourselves onto somebody else and condemn them for it, rather than look at it internally. So to truly grow as a person, one has to cease such willful blindness to one's shadow and attempt to balance it with the persona. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the last two, anima and animus, and then individuation, and then we're going to get into the 4 pillars of masculinity. So sit tight, we'll be right back. right, folks, thanks for hanging on through that break. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. That's ODYSY1.com. Go over and see all the goodness that is Odyssey Radio. And if you're listening to this show and you'd like to see the video simulcast, come on over to my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. The best part about that channel is you can join the live chat room going on right now as I'm talking. So come on over and join us. Now we're talking about the 4 pillars of masculinity. And I don't want this to be a thing that the women in our audience perceive as being, oh, this isn't for me, I can go do something else. There is stuff for everybody in this. And I think you women will want to know, you women, you people, now you females of us, you'll want to hear this stuff because I think it also involves the feminine. It involves what you will want to know about men around you, those you are closest to, those you interact with. And guys, you got to just stick around because this is for us, the 4 pillars of masculinity. But we haven't quite gotten there yet because I was going through the basis for all of this. My take on it is a Jungian philosophy to the psyche, to psychology. And we've been going through that in the first half. We got 2 more things I want to hit on Jung, and then we're going to dive into this. Not only did he talk about, just as a quick recap from the very first part of the show, he talked about the ego, the personal unconscious, the complexes we all have, the collective consciousness, the self, the persona, the shadow, and now we're going to talk about anima and animus. According to Jung, the anima and animus are the contrasexual archetypes of the psyche, with the anima being in a man and the animus in the woman. And these are built from feminine and masculine archetypes. The individual experiences as well as the experience with members of the opposite sex, beginning with a parent. And it seeks to balance out one's otherwise possible one-sided experience of gender. So like the shadow, these archetypes tend to wind up being projected, only in a more idealized form. One looks for the reflection of one's anima or animus in a potential mate. And accounting for the phenomena of love at first sight. So Jung did see either masculinity or femininity as the superior side of gender, the gender coin. Unlike many of his peers who favored masculinity, but merely as 2 halves of a whole, such as light and shadow. Without light, you can't have shadow. Without shadow, you can't have light. And so the halves ought to serve to balance one another out, the feminine and the masculine. And then there is his final point of what makes up the psyche, individuation. So individuation, according to Jung, was the quest for wholeness that the human psyche invariably undertakes. The journey to become conscious of his or herself as a unique human being, but unique only in the same sense that we are all not more or less so than others. So that uniqueness that we are all the same, not more or less so than others. And so Jung didn't try to run from the importance of conflict to human psychology. He saw it as inherent and necessary for growth. In dealing with the challenges of the outside world and one's own many internal opposites, one slowly becomes more conscious, more enlightened, and more creative. And the product of overcoming these clashes was a symbol which Jung felt would contribute to a new direction where justice was done to all sides of a conflict. And the symbol was seen as a product of the unconscious rather than of a rational thought. And it carried with it all these aspects of both the conscious and the unconscious worlds in its work as a transformative agent in individuals. And the development that springs from this transmutation, which is so essential to Jungian philosophy, is the process of individuation. So now, that's what Jungian philosophy of the psyche and of psychology entails. So as we look at that, now I want us to look at the main topic of the night, and which we may carry on for a few nights. And that is the idea of the 4 pillars of masculinity. I have heard this put different ways. From a more secular point of view, it's the king, the warrior, the magician, the lover. Those are the 4 pillars of masculinity. In a more religious sense, when I was in church work and I was leading men, we had the king, the warrior, the lover and the friend, as I think is how those went. I even forget those, but we more made it more spiritual, and so you can look at it either way. Now, what I'm attempting to do with this series is like answering the question where I think of an old Bill Moyers interview with the poet Robert Bly, A Gathering of Men. And a young man asked the question, where are the initiated men of power today? And that's on the minds of both men and women. You're going to ask that question in your relationships. You're going to ask that question of your sons, if you have a son. You're going to ask that question of our leaders and the people around us. So this is a big question. And here in the early 21st century, well, not so early anymore, I guess. We're 2020. So we're 1/5 into the 21st century. We face a crisis in masculine identity of vast proportions. And if you think that isn't so, I'm going to tell you now you're wrong. You're not looking. But you're welcome to your opinions, but you're not looking. There is a deep crisis in masculine identity. And increasingly, observers of the contemporary scene, sociologists, anthropologists, depth psychologists, are discovering the devastating dimensions of this phenomenon, which affects each of us personally as much as it affects our society as a whole. Why is there so much gender confusion today? At least in the United States and Western Europe. And it seems increasingly difficult to point to anything like either a masculine or a feminine essence that are true masculine and true feminine. There's always a million things in between. And that's what we've become, and it's created confusion. Not just amongst those who are confused about it in themselves, but to everyone else looking in from the outside. What the hell, we all ask. And so we can look at family systems. We can see the breakdown of the traditional family. More and more families display the sorry fact of the disappointing and disappearing father, which disappearance through either emotional or physical abandonment or both wreaks psychological devastation on children of both sexes. The weak or the absent father cripples both his daughters' and his sons' abilities to achieve their own gender identity and to relate in an intimate and positive way with members both of their own sex and the opposite sex. Now, I'm not saying this doesn't apply also to absentee mothers, but you see many fewer absentee mothers than men. I saw something on a comedy show the other day where there was this jerk. He pulls up in a sports car and it's got the license plate Baller on it. And he comes in, his shirt's open to his navel, and he's in the bar, and he's kind of, yeah. And he bumps into a good-looking woman and goes, hey, I want to father your children. I'm in love with you. I want to have sex with you. I want to father your children. And I promise you from now, my heart will always be behind sending you your support check every week to make sure that those kids get a good upbringing while I'm off doing my own thing. And, so it was a comedy routine, and I laughed at it. It was funny, but it's a sad commentary on, it's taking to the absurd what many men think and what they do. They abandon their kids. I could spend days talking about men who abandon their families, men who abandon their wives, men who abandon their children. And I think when I was working with men's groups, and we talked about the 4 pillars of masculinity from a more spiritual point of view, I talked about one of the greatest, not earmark, what's the word I'm looking for? One of the greatest attributes of a masculine man, of the true masculine, is the staying power. The man who stays by the stuff. The man who stays and makes things work. The man who leads in his family. The man who provides for his family. The man who is there and does not abandon his children. I will tell you, there's one thing. In my earlier life, in my late 20s, was when I first realized that I wasn't supposed to be able to father children. I had, some of you heard this story a long time ago, but I had a doctor. I was getting it checked out. Why are my wife and I not having kids? And because we did all the regular stuff that was required many times over, lots and lots. We were in our 20s, you know. And my doctor said to me one day after a bunch of tests, and he says, "Mr. Roberts, I hate to be the bearer of bad tidings, but I do not believe you will ever father children." And what we didn't know at that time, my wife was already pregnant. And by the timing later that we figured out, she was pregnant by about 2 weeks, and we didn't know it yet. And she was pregnant with my twin daughters, nonetheless. So while the doctor was telling me I couldn't father children, then at the same time, I had twins brewing in my wife's oven. And those are my daughters, Abby and Bryn, which I've talked about. And by the way, you can go see their work over at finfolkproductions.com. That's their company. I think you can go to just finfolk.com as well. But you can go over and see what they do. Mermaid Tales. And they've been at it in their 9th year now. So, boom, boom. Proud dad, boasting about my kids. But dads staying with their families. Dads being there to raise their kids. Because I got to tell you, the natural tendency of a man is to wander. And I'm not just talking lustful, sinful, philandering wandering. That's not exactly what I'm talking about. It is a man's tendency to wander. He can wander into, in olden days, men would go to the sea. "Oh, I feel the call of the sea, arr." And, there are many times, too, that, men looked at women and family and said, "Oh, I hear the siren calling to the sea." There were men who did all kinds of various things, went off on their adventures, went and did their things, their jobs. Nowadays, it's their careers and things. Men exit families more than they stay in these days because they're drawn to the siren song of the more adventurous thing, the greater thing, the bright light over on that shining hill. It's like a dog and squirrels. But so men who stick with the stuff, who stay, who are there for the kids, who do not abandon their wives and kids, these are the men that are expressing true masculinity. And we're going to get into that more later as we talk about what true masculinity is comprised of. Now, it's my belief and my experience that we can't just point in any simple way to the disintegration of the modern family system. Important as that is, to explain the crisis in masculinity, and we have to look at 2 other factors that underline this very disintegration. First, you have to look and take, and you need to take very seriously the disappearance of ritual processes for initiating boys into manhood. In traditional societies, there are standard definitions of what makes up what we call boy psychology and man psychology. This can be seen clearly in the tribal societies that have come under the careful scrutiny of such noted anthropologists as Arnold van Gennep, Victor Turner, guys like this. There are carefully constructed rituals for helping the boys in those cultures, those many societies, translate in the tribe into manhood. And over the centuries of civilization in the West, almost all of these rituals, these ritual processes, have been abandoned or have been diverted into narrower and less energized channels, into phenomena we call pseudo-initiations. So we can point to the historical background for the decline of ritual initiation. The Protestant Reformation, the Enlightenment were strong movements that shared the theme of discrediting ritual process. And once ritual is a sacred and transforming process has been discredited, what we're left with is what Victor Turner, anthropologist, has called mere ceremonial, which doesn't have the power necessary to achieve genuine transformation of consciousness. And by disconnecting from ritual, we've done away with the processes by which both men and women achieved their gender identities in a deep, mature, life-enhancing, and lifelong way. We've lost ceremony. We've lost ritual. I look at my 10-year-old son sitting out there, and I wonder, what are the things that I can do with him? What is a ritual process for him to introduce him to manhood? Many of you listeners here and listeners to the Situation Room know Reuben Fasthorse, my Native American friend. I've been looking into setting up something for my son, like a sweat lodge, a ceremony at the right time that brings him from childhood to manhood. You are now a man. And so a ceremony like that, it doesn't have to be something like that, but what we have lost is the ceremony ritual that brings our sons into men, our daughters into women. And so what happens to society if the ritual process by which these identities are formed has become discredited? And in the case of men, there are many who either had no initiation into manhood or who had pseudo-initiations that failed to evoke the needed transition into adulthood. We get the dominance of boy psychology. Boy psychology is everywhere around us, and its marks are easy to see. Among them are abusive and violent acting out behaviors against others, both men and women, passivity, weakness, the inability to act effectively and creatively in one's own life and to engender life and creativity in others, both men and women, and often an oscillation between the two, abuse and weakness, abuse and weakness. So along with the breakdown of meaningful ritual processes for masculine initiation, a second factor seems to be contributing to the dissolution of mature masculine identity. And this factor, shown to us by one strain of feminist critique, is called patriarchy. Patriarchy. Now, I've always seen that word as just meaning fatherly. I've looked at like my own. I was talking the other day about my my DNA, my ancestry, my genealogical research, and how while I've got the matriarchal line in my family and all the other people, I've basically followed the patriarchal line because I wanted to see where my name came from, where the men in my family sprouted from, and it's just as important as knowing where the women came from. And so this factor of patriarchy is the social and cultural organization that has ruled our Western world and much of the rest of the globe from at least the second millennium BCE to the present. Feminists have seen how male dominance in patriarchy has been oppressive. It's been abusive. Now, of course, you've got that this is not across the board with individuals, but this is the overall, like, a corporate consciousness that's been going on. Male domination. And it's male dominance and patriarchy has been oppressive and abusive to feminine. to the feminine, of both the so-called feminine characteristics and virtues, and actually of women themselves. Do you realize it's only been 101 years since women even got the right to vote in these United States? That's how long that has carried on. That's how we viewed women. And so, in their radical critique of patriarchy, some feminists, now this is radical, the feminists conclude that masculinity in its roots is essentially abusive. Masculinity is to be equated with abusiveness. And that the connection with eros in love, sexual love, relatedness, gentleness, tenderness, comes only from the feminine side of the human equation. You've heard me say this before in a different context. I don't believe in the feminine side of masculinity. True masculinity displays things that can be mistaken for femininity. And that in radical feminism have taken men and said, you can't be masculine in this, it's your feminine side coming out. And I think it's your true masculine side when you are tender, when you are gentle, when you relate, amongst the other things that are typical of masculinity. So as useful as some of these insights have been to the cause of both feminine and masculine liberation from patriarchal stereotypes, we believe there are serious problems with this perspective, this radical perspective. In my view, patriarchy is not the expression of deep and rooted masculinity. For the truly deep and rooted masculinity is anything but abusive. It's not abusive, true masculinity. It's the expression of boy psychology, and in part the shadow we talked about with Jung. This is where his psyche, his definitions of the psyche comes in. The shadow, the crazy side of masculinity, is where patriarchy comes from. It expresses the stunted masculine, fixated at immature levels. I'm a man and you have to do what I say because I'm a man. I'm going to put my foot down. I wear the pants. And so patriarchy, in my view, is an attack on masculinity in its fullness, as well as femininity in its fullness. Those caught up in the structures and dynamics of patriarchy seek to dominate not only women but men as well. And patriarchy is based on fear, the boy's fear, the immature masculine's fear of women, to be sure, but also fear of men. Boys fear women, but they also fear real men. And so the patriarchal male doesn't welcome the full masculine development of his sons or his male subordinates any more than he welcomes the full development of his daughters or his female employees. This is the story of the superior at the office who can't stand it that we are as good as we are. How often we're envied, hated, attacked in direct and passive-aggressive ways, even as we seek to unfold who we truly are in all our beauty, our maturity, our creativity, our generativity. And the more beautiful, competent. I just stuttered. I sounded like Joe Biden there. Sorry about that. So, the more beautiful, competent, and creative we become as individuals, male or female, the more we seem to invite the hostility of our superiors, or even of our peers. And what we're really being attacked by is the immaturity in human beings who are terrified of our advances on the road toward masculine or feminine fullness of being. Have you noticed that? Have you seen the subtle ways those attacks can come through? Patriarchy expresses what we're calling boy psychology. It's not an expression of mature masculine. potentials in their essence and in the fullness of their being, but we've come to this conclusion from our study of ancient mythology and modern dreams, from my examination from the inside of the rapid feminization of mainline religious communities, from my reflection upon the rapid changes in gender roles in our society as a whole. Have you noticed that the decay of gender roles in exchange for the radical definition of why those aren't good to have? And from our years of, there's years in clinical practice that have proven that this has come to pass. You become increasingly aware that something vital is missing in the inner lives of many men who seek out help, psychotherapy. And so I was one of them. I was one of those guys who had a lot of problems coming to terms with my own masculinity, mostly because it was, and I love my dad today. We're not close. I know him from a distance, but he abandoned us as kids, his sons. And we both sought out ways to define our masculinity in different places, other than it being role modeled to us. And I don't charge him with that today. The past is the past. It's there. We've got a relationship now, my dad and I. But we were missing that as young boys. And so a lot of men that seek out therapy because they just can't get it together, they can't figure out things, they can't figure out why their marriages fall apart and why they're not successful here or there, or they're losing their kids or whatever it might be, is really a direct result of this boy psychology. And so what's missing isn't, for the most part, what many deep-depth psychologists assume is missing, and that is adequate connection with the inner feminine. And so that's not what's missing. In many cases, these men seek help, seeking help had been and were continuing to be overwhelmed by their feminine stuff, by the feminine. What they were missing was an adequate connection to the deep and instinctual masculine energies, the potential of masculine maturity. And they were being blocked from connection to these potentials by patriarchy itself and by the feminist critique upon what little masculinity they could still hold on to for themselves. And they were being blocked by the lack in their lives of any meaningful and transformative initiatory process by which they could have achieved a sense of manhood. And we got to end there. We're out of time. There's so much more on this. We're going to talk about this more this week. So I'm going to take a 23-hour break, and we'll be back. Folks, be here tomorrow. We'll pick this right up where we left off. Thanks for joining me. Have a good night.